Lass O Lowrie'S by Hodgson Burnett. Chapter 6. To the young curate's great wonder, on his first visit to her after the advent of Liz and the child, Joan changed her manner towards him. She did not attempt to repel him. She even bade him welcome in a way of her own. Deep in Joan's heart was hidden a fancy that perhaps the work of this young fellow, who was good enough for a parson, lay with such as Liz, and those who, like Liz, bore a heavy burden. "If you can do her any good," she said, "come and welcome. Come every day. I dinna know much about such like mysen, but happen you have a way of helping folk as can help themselves in trouble, and Liz is one of them." Truly Liz was one of these. She clung to Joan in a hopeless, childish way as her only comfort. She could do nothing for herself. She could only obey Joan's dictates, and this she did in listless misery. When she had work to do, she made weak efforts at doing it, and when she had none, she sat and held the child upon her knee, her eyes following her friend with a vague appeal. The discomfort of her lot, the wretchedness of coming back to shame and jeers after a brief season of pleasure and luxury, was what crushed her. So long as she was saved from the consequences of her transgressions, it had not mattered for the rest. So long as her lover had cared for her, and she had felt no fear of hunger or cold or desertion, she had been even happy. Happy because she could idle and take no thought for the morrow, and was almost a lady. But now all that was over. She had come to the bitter dregs of the cup. She was thrown on her own resources. Nobody cared for her. Nobody helped her but Joan. Nobody called her pretty and praised her ways. She was not to be a lady after all. She must work for a living, and it must be a poor one too. There would be no fine clothes, no nice rooms, no flattery and sugar plums. Everything would be even far harder and more unpleasant than it had been before. And then the baby. What could she do with it? A creature more helpless than herself, always to be clothed and taken care of, when she could not take care of herself, always in the way, always crying and wailing and troubling day and night. She almost blamed the baby for everything. Perhaps she would not have lost her lover if it had not been for the baby. Perhaps he knew what a trouble it would be, and wanted to be rid of her before it came, and that was why he had gone away. The night Joan had brought her home, she had taken care of the child, and told Liz to sit down and rest, and had sat down herself with the small creature in her arms, and after watching her for a while, Liz had broken out into sobs, and slipped down upon the floor at her feet, hiding her wretched, pretty face upon her friend's knee. "I canna abide the sight of it," she cried. "I canna see what it were born for, mysen. I wish I did when I were in London, when he cared for me. He were fond enough of me at first. He couldn't abide me to be out of his sight. I never were so happy in my life as I were then. Aye, I didna think then as the time had come when he cast me out in road. He had no reet to do it," her voice rising hysterically. "He had no reet to do it if he were a gentleman, but it seems gentlefolk can do out they please. If he didna mean to stick to me, why couldn't he have let me be?" "That isna gentlefolk's ways," said Joan bitterly. "But if I were in your place, Liz, I wouldn't hate the child. It hasna done you as much harm as you ha' done it." After a while, when the girl was quieter, Joan asked her a question. "You never told me who you went away with, Liz," she said. "I ha' a reason for wanting to know, or I wouldn't ask. But for all that, if you dinna want to tell me, you needna do it against your will." Liz was silent for a moment. "I wouldna tell everybody," she said. "I wouldna tell nobody but you. It wouldn't do no good, and I dunna care to do harm. You'll keep it to yoursen if I tell you, Joan." "Aye," Joan answered, "as long as it needs to be kept to mysen. I am no one to clatter." "Well," said Liz with a sob, It was Mester Lancashire I went with, young Mester Lancashire, Mester Ralph." "I thought as much," said Joan, her face darkening. She had had her suspicions from the first, when Mr. Ralph Lancashire had come to Wrigham with his father, who was one of the mining company. He was a graceful, fair-faced young fellow, with an open hand and the air of a potentate, and his grandeur had pleased Liz. She was not used to flattery and fine London ways, and her vanity made her an easy victim. "He were always after me," she said with fresh tears. "He never let me be till I promised to go. He said he'd make a lady of me, and he were always give me things. He were fond of me at first, that he were, and I were fond of him. I never seed no one like him afore. Oh, it's hard it is, oh, it's bitter hard and cruel it should come to this." And she wailed and sobbed until she wore herself out, and wearied Joan to the very soul. But Joan bore with her, and never showed impatience by word or deed. Childish petulances and plaints fell upon her like water upon a rock, but now and then the strong nature was rasped beyond endurance by the weak one. She had taken no small task upon herself when she gave Liz her word that she would shield her. Only after a while, in a few weeks, a new influence began to work upon Lizzie's protectress. The child, for whom there seemed no place in the world, or in any pitying heart, the child for whom Liz felt nothing but vague dislike and resentment, the child laid, as it were, its soft hand upon Joan. Once or twice she noticed, as she moved about the room, that the little creature's eyes would follow her in a way something like its mother's, as if with appeal to her superior strength. She fell gradually into the habit of giving it more attention. It was so little and light, so easily taken from Lizzie's careless hold when it was restless, so easily carried to and fro as she went about her rough household tasks. She had never known much about babies until chance had thrown this one in her path. It was a great novelty. It liked her strong arms, and Liz was always ready to give it up, feeling only a weak bewilderment at her fancy for it. When she was at home, it was rarely out of her arms. It was no source of weariness to her perfect strength. She carried it here and there. She cradled it upon her knees when she sat down by the fire to rest. She learned in time 100 gentle woman's ways through its presence. Her step became lighter, her voice softer. A heavy tread or an unmodulated tone might waken the child. For the child's sake, she doffed her uncouth working dress when she entered the house. For the child's sake, she made an effort to brighten the dullness and soften the roughness of their surroundings. The Reverend Paul, in his visits to the house, observed with tremor the subtle changes wrought in her. Catching at the straws of her negative welcome, he went to see Liz whenever he could find a tangible excuse. He had a sensitive dread of intruding even upon the poor privacy of the lower orders, and he could rarely bring himself to the point of taking them by storm as a mere matter of ecclesiastical routine. But the oftener he saw Joan Lowrie, the more heavily she lay upon his mind. Every day his conscience smote him more sorely for his want of success with her. And yet, how could he make way against indifference? She was so powerful and unconquerable a creature. He even felt himself a trifle spellbound in her presence. He often found that he was watching her as she moved to and fro, watching her as Liz and the child did. But in his case, the watching arose from a mingled wonder and admiration. But Parson was Parson to her still, a good-natured, simple little fellow, who might be a trifle better than other folks, but who certainly seemed weaker. A frail little gentleman in spectacles, who was afraid of her, or was at least easily confounded, who might be of use to Liz, but who was not in her line. Better in his way than his master in his, but still a person to be regarded with just a touch of contempt. The confidence established between Grace and his friend Fergus Derrick leading to the discussion of all matters connected with the parish and parishioners, led naturally to the frequent discussions of Joan Lowrie, among the rest. Over tea and toast in the small parlour, the two men often drew comfort from each other. When Derek strode into the little place and threw himself in his favourite chair, with knit brows and weary irritation in his air, Grace was always ready to detect his mood and wait for him to reveal himself. Or, when Grace looked up at his friend's entrance with a heavy, pained look on his face, Derek was equally quick to comprehend. There was one trouble in which Derek specially sympathised with his friend. This was in his feeling for Anise Barham. Silent as Paul was apt to be upon the subject, his quiet passion rather gained strength than lost it. His evenings at the rectory were a source of delicious pain to him. Duty called him frequently to the house, and his position with regard to its inhabitants was necessarily familiar. Mr. Barham did not spare his curate. He was ready to delegate to him all labour in which he was not especially interested himself, or which he regarded as scarcely worthy of his mettle. Grace makes himself very useful in some cases, he would say. A certain kind of work suits him, and he is able to do himself justice in it. He is a worthy enough young fellow in a certain groove, but it is always best to confine him to that groove. So when there was an ordinary sermon to be preached or a commonplace piece of work to be done, it was handed over to Grace, with a few tolerant words of advice or comment, and as commonplace work was rather the rule than the exception, the Reverend Paul's life was not an idle one. Anice's manner towards her father's curate was so gentle and earnest, so frank and full of trust in him, that it was not to be wondered at that each day only fixed her more firmly in his heart. Nothing of his conscientious labour was lost upon her. Nothing of his self-sacrifice and trial was passed by indifferently in her thoughts of him. His pain and his effort went to her very heart. Her belief in him was so strong that she never hesitated to carry any little bewilderment to him, or to speak to him openly upon any subject. To the very centre of her pure, appreciative nature, she was his friend. Small marvel that he found it delicious pain to go to the house day by day, feeling himself so near to her, yet knowing himself so far from any hope of reaching the sealed chamber of her heart. Notwithstanding her knowledge of her inability to alter the unfairness of his position, Annie still managed to exert some slight influence over her friend's fate. "Do you not think, Papa, that Mr. Grace has had a great deal to do?" she suggested once, when he was especially overburdened. "A great deal to do?" he said. "Well, he has enough to do, of course, my dear, but then it is work of a kind that suits him. I never leave anything very important to Grace. You do not mean, my dear, that you fancy he has too much to do?" "Rather too much of a dull kind," answered Anise. "Dull work is tiring, and he has a great deal of it on his hands. All that schoolwork, you know, Papa. If you could share it with him, I should think it would make it easier for him." "My dear Anise," the rector protested, "if Grace had my responsibilities to carry on his shoulders, but I do not leave my responsibilities to him. In my opinion, he is hardly fitted to bear them. They are not in his line." But seeing a dubious look on the delicate face opposite him, "But if you think the young fellow has really too much to do, I will try to take some of these minor matters upon myself. I am equal to a good deal of hard work," evidently feeling himself somewhat aggrieved. But Anise made no further comment. Having dropped a seed of suggestion, she left it to fructify, experience teaching her that this was her best plan. It was one of the good rector's weaknesses to dislike to find his course disapproved, even by a wholly uninfluential critic. He was never exactly comfortable when her views did not strictly accord with his own. To find that Anise was regarding even a favourite whim with questioning was for him to begin to falter a trifle inwardly, however testily rebellious he might feel. He was a man who thrived under encouragement, and sank at once before failure. Failure was unpleasant, and he rarely contended long against unpleasantness. It was not a fair wind and no favour with him. He wanted both the fair wind and the favour, and if either failed him, he felt himself rather badly used. So it was through this discreetly exerted influence of Annice's that Grace, to his surprise, found certain somewhat irksome tasks taken from his shoulders at this time. But he did not know that it was Annice he had to thank for the temporary relief.